Jesse, that's the $1 million question right there. I mean, what is the right amount, right? So that we can, so that the American people, right, can respond, to an event like this, because these things will happen in the future, right?
Hmm.
But I think the general consensus is that nobody wants to see this, this hit the American economy and public health to this level ever again, right?
Welcome to the Modern BioPharma podcast. The world of today's medicines is big, complex, and constantly changing. Our goal is to give you insight into the people that are manufacturing the medicines people need every day, whether it is the people taking care of these facilities, or those building them, or those maintaining the quality and integrity of every dose that is delivered to the patient. We interview the people that are making it happen and give you a chance to get to know them while we're at it. Thanks for saying hi.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Modern BioPharma podcast. This is Jesse, and I'm here today with James Zwiefel from Burns McDonnell Engineers. How are you doing today, James?
Jesse, I'm doing great. Thanks for this opportunity.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you on today. I don't know James. I actually reached out to James. He'd put out an article recently in regards to pharma onshoring. In light of what's going on with COVID right now and a lot of the concerns with our supply chain. And I just thought it was a great topic. I think it's a very timely topic. And so I reached out to James and asked if he'd like to be on today. And he graciously said yes. So I'm excited to just talk to him about this subject today. As we get going, James, I don't know who knows you. I don't know who knows me. Everybody's randomly listening online. So if you could you just start by just telling us a little about who you are?
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. It'd be my pleasure. I'm a father of three, and husband. We live on a small hobby farm in Western New York, a beautiful area, and we spend a lot of time outdoors, playing sports with the kids, maintaining the property, riding horses. We're very active outdoor type of people, I guess you could say. I've had the privilege over the years to live in a number of different states, living in Alaska and Hawaii over the years, and so you could say mountains and seafood have kind of shaped who I am over the years. I'm really proud of the fact that we've seen and done some really great things as a family over the years. So right now we're in the process of relocating to Minneapolis. It's kind of a homecoming, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And so later this year we'll be relocating to Minneapolis. So we're excited about that.
Wow. So you've been Alaska, and I've been to almost every state in the U.S. Alaska and Hawaii are two that I have not been. What brought you to Alaska and Hawaii?
Well, it's great to visit those states as a tourist, but it's much better to live there, right?
Ah.
And so, what brought me to Alaska and Hawaii was big military construction programs. I've had the privilege over the years to work on some really large military bed down operations, 5-year, multi-year design and construction programs. And so that brought me to Alaska. And when that one wrapped up, a similar line of work brought me down to Hawaii. So it's been an exciting many years of managing very large design and construction programs.
Wow. So was that as a civilian, or were you part of the military?
A little bit of both. I've been a member of the Air National Guard for many years, recently retired from the Air National Guard. And so over the years, that military association has turned into some full-time work. And so it changed from year to year, but sometime I was wearing a civilian clothes and other times in uniform.
Awesome. Awesome. Which you were Air National Guard?
Air National Guard,
Air
that's
National
right.
Guard. All right. So James, we know each other not very well yet, but I have to tell you, we have a few things in common. So I
Yes,
was
we
Air
do.
Force. I was not Air National Guard, but I was Air Force. Um, I was engineering in the Air Force. So you were maybe civil engineering, I'm guessing, if you.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. So I was more on the development side. I also have a small hobby farm in the Northeast. So I have more kids than you, though. So not
Yeah.
that that's a competition.
I'll let you win that one,
Yeah,
Jesse.
I know, right? Yeah, what a win. All right, so we know some of your background then professionally. So that's a great background from on the construction side of things. What else have you done professionally outside of those military efforts?
Yeah, thank you for that. In addition to working military projects years ago, I've been doing global manufacturing for many years now, and that's taken me all over the world. Spent some time in Europe, mostly in China, but really all across Asia as well. So managing global manufacturing expansions, a big expansion plans from greenfields to brownfield projects, doing a lot of site selection activities, working with governments, developers, and managing global capital spend for a number of global manufacturing corporations.
Wow, so you have seen the world. Holy moly.
I've seen a lot of different perspectives.
You've seen all four corners of the U.S., I'm guessing, and then all the rest of the corners of the world. So, wow, that's quite a background. Awesome. Well, I want to just jump right into the subject for today, which is talking about sort of this pharma onshoring. And if you were to go online right now and do a search on this, and one of the things I like to do is do searches, and then if you're in Google, you click the news button rather than just the results button. If you were to look at pharma onshoring or pharma offshoring, depending on what you're looking at, and click news, you are going to see a lot of stuff right now. The supply chain for our the pharmaceutical industry just like rose straight to the top of priorities, right? Even from like a national security strategy kind of thing. This isn't just about making sure people are healthy. It really comes down. It gets to the highest levels of government, which I did see you point that out in your article. And it's not just us. Like literally all the countries of the world are kind of thinking the same thing right now,
Yes.
Which I thought that actually I wasn't thinking about when I looked it up. But if you go, you'll see articles for the U.S. obviously, because we're in the U.S. But you'll see a bunch for Europe. You'll see them for China, even though ultimately we end up talking about China as maybe a weak point for us. But you see them about all these different areas, and they go, hey. At the end of the day, we're responsible as a nation to take care of ourselves, because we're a nation first, right? So how do we do that? And there's a lot out there. So I'm glad we get to talk about this. So, I've already sent you a few questions that I want to talk to you about today. And, I don't think we need to go through your article directly, but I guess the first question that I think comes to mind is there's this big crisis right now because of COVID. Do you think this actually is a crisis? Do you look at this issues with our supply chain as a crisis, in the grand scheme of things, or is it just sort of the short-term reaction, because we don't have it right now, and we need a better system. What do you think about that?
I don't know that I would describe it as a crisis. I mean, it's significantly disrupting global markets, right? But I would think of it as maybe one of the most significant reflection points in the U.S. economy, right? Perhaps in our lifetime. You think about other events that have sort of shaped the landscape over the years, right? September 11th, the attacks of September 11th forever changed how we travel, right? And the global downturn in 2008. I mean, two big events that forever changed how we think, how business operate, and how we interact with the world around us. I think this is going to be significant, more so than those two events in terms of how business operate, how companies in the future perform risk reviews, right, and how they determine where they manufacture, whether that's offshore or onshore. I think this is going to be more significant, those other two events combined.
So, given that so much of our global supply chain, it's by multinational corporations, right? So it's which are kind of they're not separate from countries. Like they're all sort of based in a certain country, and maybe they have most of their operations in the country. But they're as large corporations, they're thinking across the globe. So how do we view that from sort of a national strategy, and how do we look at how policy might change in that regard versus a company that's just U.S. based or a company that's global? Like, what kind of dynamics do you see there?
Yeah, well, I'm a free market guy, right? First and foremost, and what we're talking about is private investment, right? So these corporations, they're going to expand manufacturing operations for a lot of the right reasons, right? They're going to want to reduce labor costs. They're going to want to have access to Asian markets, right? And by reducing labor costs, that increases margins. So these our American manufacturing companies are making decisions that ultimately has led to offshoring. For decades, for many years, right? And for a lot of the right reasons, right? Again, I'm a free market type of person, right? And that said, when so much of the manufacturing capacity is offshore, you get to a point where you're reaching sort of a critical mass that's no longer here, right? In the U.S. And so what's happened is we've lost transparency, right? And we in the U.S. we think about the knowing where our manufacturing capacity is I think valuable information, right? But the reality is, and last October, the federal government was trying to determine where this manufacturing capacity was located, and they understand that more than 80% of API, active pharmaceutical ingredients, are manufactured outside of the United States, primarily in China and India, right? And so, there are so many reasons why this has happened, but this COVID-19 pandemic, right, has sort of shined a light on that. And I think a lot of people are suddenly becoming aware of the fact that so much of our API is manufactured outside of the U.S. And for a lot of people are very, very uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, and some raw ingredients are even greater than that percentage. I believe it's more like 90+% exposure right now. So, yeah, that's there's a lot there's a lot there. Wow. What's funny is I had it was a number of years ago now. I got to go to an event in New York City where you know who Jeff Immelt? You remember Jeff Immelt? He used to be the CEO
No.
of CEO of GE.
GE,
So,
okay.
yeah, pretty important dude. He's the kind of guy that has lunch with the president on a regular basis. And I got to be in this lunch with him, and everybody was really upset with some of the manufacturing that had moved overseas. And he said, look, I'm responsible to the shareholders of my company, and I need to manufacture where the buyers are, because ultimately, from a supply chain perspective, he goes, that's mitigating a lot of my risk, right? Because if I have China is buying a whole bunch of stuff, then I need to make sure I'm manufacturing in China. It gives me some advantages because I'm over there. It mitigates a lot of risks. My supply chain is a little bit tighter to the market. And he's like, if the U.S. is buying a bunch of stuff, then we need to be manufacturing in the U.S. And then there's always the trade back and forth. But I think something that gets lost in the sort of the broader discussion about some of this onshoring, offshoring is that we just talk about the cost of manufacturing, right? So we go, oh, well, this API, it's kind of a low value product, so we want to minimize costs, so we put it somewhere where it's low cost. But there's all these layers, and they're being exposed very quickly of potential cost that you just don't see
Right.
during normal times. But as soon as not normal times show up, guess what? Pops, right?
Yeah, that's right. Right.
Yeah. So how do you think? How do we measure that? How do we do that sort of risk analysis to say, yeah, I know it's cheaper to do it over here, but we need to balance that with the risk of not even having it available if something happens.
Well, it's hitting the balance sheets right now, right, of many corporations. So there's a lot of risk review and analysis that's happening right now. And so I think many CFOs are going to be asking questions, right, about what makes sense for us going forward. Whether that's to continue offshoring or to consider onshoring. But I think this is more than a short-term trend. I think this is a long-term. Offshoring has happened over decades, right? And it's not going to change overnight. But this conversation is a good one, right? And there's going to be many, many more to follow. And what will it take effectively to better stabilize the pharmaceutical supply chain? These are questions that we have to answer. Won't be answered right away.
Right. Well, I was hoping that we'd fix this today during our half hour, but all right, I guess it's a good start.
The next session.
Yeah, next session. All right. Well, part 2 on its way. So what do you right now see as maybe one of the larger, the biggest weak points in our supply chain for biopharma?
Well, I think for biopharma and for pharmaceutical industry in general, one of the biggest weak points is just that the lack of visibility in terms of where that manufacturing capacity ultimately comes from, right? And in this situation, this COVID-19 pandemic, how do we be able to manufacture enough PPE for our medical professionals to provide care, right? How do we get vaccines developed and in production, right, to be able to respond to this crisis? And when that manufacturing capacity has been offshored, you don't quickly turn that around and bring that back, in a matter of months to be able to respond, right? And so there seems to be a real need to identify, to understand how much needs to be in the United States to be able to respond to these from a national security perspective, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's it's one of my other questions, but they kind of all go together. Like, how do you get to that? What is that number? What is that magic number that's like, well, if we had 35% of our APIs manufactured in the U.S. or 70 or 20, or what is that magic number to be okay? And does that even make sense? Because it could just be this kind of API, who knows, right? So what do how do we go about even discussing that in a meaningful way?
Well, that's Jesse. That's the $1 million question right there. I mean, what is the right amount, right? So that we can, so that the American people, right, can respond, to an event like this, because these things will happen in the future, right? But I think the general consensus is that nobody wants to see this, this hit the American economy and public health to this level ever again, right? I just don't think that's going to be acceptable going forward. And so, again, the $1 million question: what is the right amount of American manufacturing capacity? We know today that 20% is not the right answer, right? That's not what we've got today. Is not sustainable. But we also know that going to 100%, bringing it all back, is just not practical, not possible, right? So the answer usually is somewhere in the middle. And that's where the discussion and debate will happen in the near term. And I think that's going to be a conversation at for state and federal government. That's, I believe, already begun, but will accelerate very quickly going forward.
So have you been involved in this? So you have this experience overseas and stateside. Were you part of some of those discussions when, say, you were working in China and something was being moved to China? Were you part of that planning and how maybe a company decided to do something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Did a lot of site selection, both U.S. and in China and Asia, right? And so, it's a lot. It's a very rewarding activity, right? And there's lots of decisions that go into where and when we make decisions to expand, right? And so, the low access to low labor cost is a huge driver, right, in that decision, but also ultimately associating with the supply chain location is a big one too, right? But
Mm.
to be able to reverse that trend will require a number of incentives, other motivations as well. And I think you're seeing that. Um, uh, we'll be seeing more and more of that in the very, very near future.
Yeah. So do you think that, say, access to the right supply chain was just sort of considered not enough in former calculations, or do you really think it was just kind of inconsequential because we've sort of fully globalized in many respects? As long as you could get the train there, you could get an airplane there, is it really a big deal? Do you think it was just, I don't know, maybe that's the wrong question. Like, how do you think it was considered, I guess, before now? Because we know now all of a sudden, boom, it's whoops, we missed something. But, was it being considered before?
The possibility of doing more onshoring being considered, I think.
Well, I mean, when they do when they make decisions to offshore, um, was the idea that, hey, we need to maintain, in certain localities, really much of the equation, from like a
Yeah,
real sense, not just a perception, or we need good PR, you know.
right. It varies from from project team to project team, company to company, right? In terms of where and when they expand, but ultimately there's the financial drivers are the biggest biggest factor, right? That
Mm-hmm.
and access to different markets and such. And so to reverse that trend, like I said, will require government incentives, I believe, because they're made available in India and China, right? And so I do believe that we're going to see on a state by state and then federal level significant incentives, right? Because we're talking about private investment and private decisions, right?
Mm-hmm.
That companies are making on an individual basis, and so those state and federal incentives will be coming in the near future, is my belief.
Okay. So, looking to the future, where, say, we do start to onshore, and generically speaking, we're talking about, say, again, the sort of lower value products that we would be onshoring rather than the higher value. It makes me think of when you buy an iPhone, right? Everybody knows that an iPhone is made in China, but what does it say on the box?
Right.
It says, like, designed in the USA, or engineered in the USA, or something like that, right? And you're like,
Right.
huh, interesting. That's an interesting
Yeah.
way of thinking about that. So when we look at doing this in the future, like, I think the immediate response is, but that's going to make everything more expensive. So your ibuprofen bottle that's $5 now is going to be $20 if we make it in the U.S., because that's an easy one, right? So do you think that's the case, or do you think maybe some other things are going to come into play to make it not that way for us?
Yeah, a great question. You mentioned iPhones and consumer electronics, right? I mean, everybody understands when you buy a flat screen TV or a laptop computer, everybody understands that that product is being manufactured in China, right? And but again, to our earlier point, a lot of people are surprised to understand how much of our API is manufactured outside the U.S., right? And so this is such an important conversation to be having, and we need to continue to have. But how do we, in the short term, perhaps onshoring could result in some higher prices for our, some of our medicines and treatments and such. But I really think advanced manufacturing techniques long term will be able to, control the costs of the manufacturing of some of this API going forward.
Mm.
So in the short term, yes, I would agree that potentially that it could result in higher costs in the short term.
Right. So, yeah, and I had a question here, like, what are some things that could be done to mitigate some of the risks outside of onshoring? So you sort of brought up by onshoring, these are some things that we maybe could do to mitigate the price risk, I guess, or the price loss. Sure, I'm not saying that right, but as we seek to sort of achieve this balance, we're not bringing 100. There's no way it's going to all come back. It's going to take a while. So what are maybe some things that you think are out there that we could use or put in place to if this happened again next year or in 2 years, and to build a plant takes a couple years, so that's not going to be done. So what are some things that can be put in place to soften the blow, 2 years from now if this was to happen again?
Well, I mean, one area to be able to pull back to reshore a lot of manufacturing capacity is to really leverage our CDMOs, right, our contract manufacturers. So that's a way to move very quickly in terms of reshoring some manufacturing capacity. They're able to scale up very, very quickly, right? That's their business model.
Yep.
Another way to be able to bring to incentivize American manufacturing, specifically in the pharma space, is through a Buy American program or Buy American Act. Expand that. With your Air Force background, I'm sure you're very familiar with that. In that federal and military construction area, right? When you're building federal facilities, you have to be able to show that a certain percentage of the building materials, right, were produced in the U.S. And so you could do the same thing with PPE, right, and other pharmaceutical products. You could require that a certain percentage of that is purchased and manufactured locally.
So something that I've seen over the years in sales and just being in different industries is the effect that sort of the lean manufacturing concepts have had overall in the supply chain. In some ways, it's revolutionized our ability to get things out fast and where they need, but at the same time, the buffer is very slim, right? So
by design,
all it takes is and I'm thinking of like a big facility that was built in North Carolina recently, and like they bought so much equipment like all at once, they literally like sucked all the resources out of the supplier base, right? Like all of a sudden they had to buy multiple brands of pumps just because the one company that they probably would have preferred just couldn't do it all, like, right, and still serve all their other customer base. So do you maybe see anything there? I mean, that's a business model, across the board issue where, you don't want capital stuck on a shelf, right? But
right.
maybe that's something that we need to be doing. I don't know. What do you think?
I love your comment about lean and building that into our business models, right? I mean that's really transformed the manufacturing industry. But to your point, right, we have no buffer, right? There's no inventory there, and I think that becomes part of the analysis, right, that a company will make going forward. They'll be asking themselves, do we need to maintain this inventory, right? So that'll be company by company. We'll be asking and answering that question, but then also nationally, right? This goes to our strategic stockpiles, right? Of PPE and other other medicines and such. So and that nationally, if you buy this up or on a state level, we can protect against this COVID pandemic from happening again.
Yeah. All right. Well, as we're having this conversation, my mind's coming up with about a million questions for each response that you give me. There's a lot of rabbit holes we can go down with this. But ultimately, I just wanted to have this conversation with you. I think this is a really valuable one to have, and I think it's important for everybody to think about it. Like, I think so many times this is kind of a heady thing. This is a senior leadership, right, discussion. But, having the discussion with, sort of amongst the rest of us, I think is important to give us exposure to it and understand ultimately, what's going on. And honestly, the complexity of these decisions. Like, I think we have a tendency to oversimplify. And we're like, oh, we need to just bring it back to America. Like, I mean, really, is that what we want to do? And a lot of people just sort of throw things like that around and put the bumper sticker on their car. And I think intent-wise, that's positive, and that's fine to do. But there's a lot to this, and there's a lot of sort of unintended consequences of any of sort of those major decisions if we did them. So I think this is a conversation that I'm glad we could have today, but I think it's just going to continue. We're going to see it in the public spotlight moving forward. So before we finish up here, I guess I just wanted to give you one chance to just sort of tell us a little bit more about, your company, what you guys do, and maybe your involvement in this right now.
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity, Jesse. As you mentioned earlier, I work for Burns McDonnell. It's a global engineering firm. We are comprised of 7,600 design engineers, construction professionals, scientists, consultants, with 55 offices globally. So we with that many offices, we've got a local footprint in most states across the country, and that brings a lot of capability to owners, especially in the manufacturing space. But at Burns McDonnell, we've got a number of we're a family of companies, a number of different industries that we support, from aviation to telecommunications, environmental, military, and commercial buildings as well. I'm in the manufacturing space. It's one of the reasons, while I'm relatively new to Burns McDonnell, I'm not new to the capabilities. I mentioned to you, I've spent most of my career on the owner's side, and for more than a decade, I've been hiring Burns and McDonnell across multiple industries that I've worked in. And so this has been very rewarding. I'm sitting in a space at Burns and McDonnell where I'm able to be client facing, right, and sit down with owners, help them decide where and when they're going to expand. And match them with the talent of Burns and McDonnell to be able to make, I call it early engagement, make these important decisions, very, very early on, help them with pre-capital planning, which is so important and relevant to this situation that we're in right now globally.
And so you're located in right now. You're in New York, moving to Minneapolis. You mentioned what your headquarters is. Where is it at?
Headquartered in Kansas City, but we're really a local engineering firm in that we have so many regional offices that we have a good footprint as well.
Excellent. Yeah. And I know I met with at least one of your local offices in the past down in Greenville, South Carolina, which is a nice spot. I had never been to Greenville. I'm sorry, not Greenville, North Carolina. Greenville, South Carolina.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yes.
let me get it right. I knew of it, but I was like, man, this is a great little city. I was really impressed with it. So, and you got a great team down there that I met with. So, anyways, well, this has been great. I'm glad I got to meet you, James. Thanks for coming on here today. And, we'll make sure that on the show, everybody knows who you are and connected to you, say on LinkedIn. So if anybody has any questions or want to talk to James, you can reach out to him through LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way, because that'll be connected right on the show notes. And if you have any questions, let's throw them up on the episode. We'd love to hear what questions people have, and maybe we can do another discussion in the future about that, or we could just answer them right there on the show itself. So what do you think?
Jesse, thanks for doing this. Just love your podcast. You're operating in a space. It's just exciting to keep this conversation going around BioPharma.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, James, and we'll talk to you on the other side.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks again for listening to the Modern BioPharma podcast. Please reach out if there is someone you'd like us to interview or a topic you'd like us to discuss. We will make it happen. And don't forget to like us on iTunes or subscribe on YouTube. It helps us get the word out. See you next time.